Hi, welcome to another episode of Start the Week with Wisdom. I'm your host, Bridget Burns from the University Innovation Alliance.
And I'm Doug Lederman, editor and co-founder of Inside Higher Ed.
Each week, we bring you a short interview from some guest who is a leader in the field that we think will give you insight, perspective, and wisdom for the week ahead. That's why we call it Start the Week with Wisdom. Weekly Wisdom is sponsored by Mainstay, which is formerly known as AdmitHub. And they're a student retention and engagement platform that has proven it works through peer-reviewed research, specifically when it helped Georgia State reduce their summer melt by 21%. And in a separate peer-reviewed study, they also were able to help them retain 1,200 additional students. So to learn more about Mainstay, I would recommend going to mainstay.com to read about their research on a variety of campuses. But now we'll hand it off.
And we're joined in this week's wisdom is going to be brought to you by Dr. DeAngela Burns-Wallace. She's currently a trustee at Stanford. She's had an extensive career in higher education. She's also she recently spent her time as the CIO, Secretary of Administration for the state of Kansas. And before that, and before some time in higher ed, she worked at the State Department. So she's done a bunch of things, and now she's taking a little bit of a pause, which we're going to hear a lot about. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I gave folks a little preview on last week's episode about just how impressive your career has been, because, in my mind, someone who is able to lead in higher ed and then get asked by the governor of a state to help during a pandemic, during a crisis, and then you continue to move on, Secretary of Administration, the CIO, that's really, I'm sure that was incredibly difficult work, but as a result, I just knew that you had leadership wisdom to share. So we're so honored that you are taking the time to share that with us.
Thank you.
So let's start there in terms of your pause. Okay, so I love that I saw that you were going to be taking an intentional pause and that you were transitioning out of government. And it's because you actually are trying to do this. You're actually trying to set yourself up for success. And I feel like that's a really, it's smart. We need more people to do this and so that they don't burn out. Can you talk to us about what are you doing? How did this come about? And what advice can you already share with folks?
So this intentional pause, it's actually a good friend of mine wrote a book that's called Intentional Pause. And so when I started to say, I'm going to take a break, I'm going to take a pause, she said, you got to be intentional about it. And she was very much right. Her name is Kim Alexis Newton. And for me, it was a moment of the last 4 years of serving the state of Kansas in the roles, given everything that we faced. And I stepped into the roles before the pandemic, so didn't know that was what I was getting into. So understand that. But after going through the 4 years, there was a moment where I really felt like I completed the work that I had been brought there to do. That in some ways I wasn't being the leader that I knew I could, because I was too tired, because I was stretched thin, because I needed something to renew and to refresh. And instead of running, away from something, or just changing and saying, okay, I'm going to pivot and do this, I really needed a moment to get back to me, why I led, the things that I wanted to do, the places that I wanted to have impact. And not that that wasn't happening at the state, but I wasn't being my best self as a leader because I was too tired to see in that space. And so for me, this is a moment where I am just going back to my why, going back to conversations with colleagues and friends about the impact that we've had across different areas, and trying to take a moment to say, so what is it that I want to do next? Where can I leverage the work that I've done in federal government, higher education, state government, and continue to have significant impact? And for me, more importantly, the uniqueness of all of that coming together, I think that there are places and spaces where I can leverage my voice that maybe others cannot. And I need to be strategic about what that looks like for the greatest impact.
I love that. Again, I think more people need to be doing this before they get into crisis. Doug, did you want to follow
Well,
up?
I'm interested because and I'm envious, I will say, as somebody who feels like he's been running, kind of nonstop for a lot of years. I guess I'm curious whether it is do you consider it a luxury, or because I guess I'm trying to think about how, what do you think are going to be the differences between the way you're doing this with this sort of intentionality, and maybe it's from the book, I'm not sure, but versus just taking a breath and I guess I'm trying to think about how, and I'm curious if you have thoughts yet about whether sort of the only way to do it is by stepping back in the way you're stepping sort of fully.
Yeah. So, Doug, I am so with you. So first of all, I have to say, I know that it is a privilege to be able to do this. I sit in a place in my career, in my life, that I am able to stop and take a pause. I'm on faculty at USC, so I still teach. I do some consulting. So, I have different kind of avenues that I pull together. So I'm not quite still. I'm on the border of Stanford. I'm still busy. But this intentional piece of this is about being able to take stock of a few things, right? To be able to really see kind of what is the work that I've been doing and how do I want to leverage that work differently. I love higher ed and I love the work that I did in higher ed, but I'm a policy wonk by training. And so for me, when I look at who is shaping and forming higher ed policy right now, there are nonprofits, foundations, other think tanks that are strong voices in that space in this moment. And to be someone who has helped to lead an institution, but also to lead in government spaces and then to lend my voice to shaping policy in that way, I sit in a unique position to be able to do something like that everybody can't. So it's really taking a step back and thinking about not just, oh, that's a fun job or that looks interesting, but for me in this moment, where can I be most impactful, right? I'll be honest though, recognizing everybody can't take a full pause, right? Everybody can't just say, I'm not going to have a full-time job tomorrow, right? So another piece of this has just been about how do then we, and it's a piece of, the work that Bridget shared in terms of my past talk, how do you clear enough of your clutter if you can't fully stop to actually create space for creativity and innovation? So if you can't do a full stop, how do you create time and space where you can be intentional about how you're thinking about the work that you do, how you're thinking about the work that's adjacent to the work that you do, right? How do you control, and that's a big word, emails and schedules and information overload to a level that it gives you enough space to not just be drowned in the day-to-day, but to really have that intentionality in how you're moving through your work, right? You can't be your best self if you're bogged down. You can't be that strong leader if you can't see through all of the day-to-day to actually get to what you're brought there for, to lead, to vision, to be strategic, to be transformational. That's what leaders do.
I love it. And that's, I remember, so I first met Dr. Burns-Wallace when we were both ACE fellows actually together way back. And then she was the liaison for one of our institutions at the time. And I remember watching her we were at a meeting and seeing how back to back she was. And then there was just a way that she engaged with her assistant that was different. There was this folder swapping that happened between meetings. And I was like, what's going on here? And she's like, put this on my project time. And so I was like, how do you get through all the stuff? And that was what led to a series of additional chances for us to learn from you. But you would carve out project time for yourself every day. And then your assistant would embed your specific tasks into your project time so that you actually had time to work on your work, which I think is the underlying thing here, is that people need time to work on their work. And it was for me, so I still have project time on my calendar every day as a result of this. So I don't use it as well as you did, but I'm just saying, you are a real master when it comes to being strategic with the stuff that feels kind of messy and hard. So I just want to offer that. Since that time, you then went on to become the Secretary of Administration. You went on to become the CIO for the state. Have you learned any other skills about navigating and like multiple plates that help you?
Mm-hmm. So when I moved to the state, I actually received two roles. So the Chief Information Officer, so the CIO for the state, and the Secretary of Administration are two separate cabinet seats. So it was a lot of fun. What I will say is that I think I doubled down into leveraging into my team, right? There's a reality that particularly when we start in the trenches and we do this work and you are that leader that knows it and like gets in the data and gets in the day-to-day, like you roll up your sleeves and you're used to that, right? As we continue to move through and when your organizations get more complex, when they get more broad, when they as the Secretary of Administration, I had 10 different functional areas, everything from procurement to compliance and audit to buildings and leases, the state printer, HR, I mean, you name it. And these are all distinct functions. And then I had IT. So the doubling down into my staff, the really taking the time to invest, I technically had over 20 direct reports, and I met with each one of them on a regular basis because that time that I invested in pouring back into them and empowering them in, being generous with my time, my talents, my experience for them is actually what propelled us because they knew their operation better than I ever could. My job wasn't to get in the weeds with them. It was to navigate for them. It was to protect them so that they could do the work that they needed to do. It was to elevate them. I talked about these operational aspects not being invisible anymore. We needed to be highly visible because without us, operations wouldn't function, but we needed to deliver in a seamless way. Right. And so that doubling down into my staff, truly being able to create pathways of investment and development of my teams to empower those leaders to actually leverage their expertise and experience. That was the game changer. That was my saving grace because I could not do it all at that level of complexity. And I had to have a level of trust and engagement. But you got to pour in. You got to give a little bit of yourself. You got to be vulnerable and be a little bit of generous of kind of with your time in those experiences. And it took a lot of time, but that time paid off tremendously.
Can I ask a quick follow-up before we dive in? I want to know, so this is the nuts and bolts stuff that people always want to know, which is when you have a one-on-one with people, what is your first question or like, what's the agenda? If you were to coach someone on how to have effective one-on-ones, what for you have you learned over time that you would say to baby Dr. Burns-Wallace, this is what I've learned that actually sets you up well?
So first of all, the agenda is set by that individual. That agenda has to be to me 24 hours before our meeting. And then anything else that they want me to review or to look at must be with their agenda 24 hours. I review it the night before. I make my questions, anything I need in preparation for it. It is on them to lead. What is it that you need from me? What is it that you need me to know? What is it that you need for me to follow up on? And is there anything in your world I need to be aware of in case I'm in a meeting with another secretary, or I happen to walk down the hall and the governor says, hey, such and such happened, and I need to know it, right? And so part of it is helping them help me lead, because I can't know everything. But that's a big piece of it, right? And at the end of it, it's also a trail of connection and follow-up. Right. So as much as I had those one-on-one meetings, then I would have our regular group meetings of that leadership team, and I would help them make the connections. Each of them is telling me different pieces of information, but I can see the bigger picture, which is what my job is for. And so I would intentionally make the connections from our one-on-ones back into, hey, I need you talking to such and such. I don't know if you know, but they're doing X, Y, and Z. Let's try to make that happen. And so that follow-up with making connections, whether it was across our department or either external to our department, right? But also using my assistant, because when I came out of that one-on-one, if there was anything that they needed from me, making sure it got calendared. Okay, they're going to need me to review such and such. Make sure you're looking forward so I can get it back to them. Like, but I need them to be the driver, right? And of course, I will bring any issues I have, but my issues come second. And you'd be so surprised how impactful it can be for that director, for that leader, when they know that they're leading that meeting, how prepared they are, the information they bring forward to you. And some of it I may never use, but I feel very confident they know what's going on. And if I never use it at any point in time, it didn't matter, because I had a confidence that they knew what was going on and how to handle it because they briefed me on it.
I feel like this is the clip that people use over and over there. So Doug, I'll leave it with you. That was great. Thank you for that.
I'm always interested when people bounce back and forth between higher ed and government. I just did a podcast, an Inside Higher Ed podcast interview with Terry Hartle, the longtime government relations person at ACE, and we were talking about the disconnect that we've been talking a lot about between increasing disconnect between college leaders and colleges and governments and I guess Terry said interestingly that he viewed the translation problem as more significant. He said higher ed folks understand government people even less than government people understand higher ed people, and he felt that was the harder part of his job. And I'm just curious, as somebody who has had a foot in both camps, what you sense is where do you see the biggest disconnects, and how have you worked to try to overcome them, and not necessarily smooth them over, because some of the differences are legitimate and necessary, but I'm just curious how you view that interaction.
It's very real. So, my career from federal to higher ed and then to state government, I see myself as a policymaker that has pulled, kind of marshaled resources, people, policy to impact different environments and communities, right? So as I moved through them, I saw them very similarly of what we're trying to accomplish and the mechanisms we have being in the public sector. But there's a reality of this disconnect around the priorities and the needs at, say, a state or federal level comparison to, higher ed institutions. And I see that both from the seats I was in, where I was at MU or KU, sitting on the board of trustees now at Stanford, and just seeing many different things playing out at the federal level that's impacting higher ed institutions. I think part of the disconnect is there is in some pockets and this is growing, not a full understanding of the power of higher ed, the outcomes of higher ed. We haven't always told our story well, and the pieces of our story that make the headlines are not the good pieces. It's about the cost, and it's about, the scandals, or it's about the elitism, and some of the impact, right? And that greater impact, the income mobility that we provide, you cannot hit a higher ed institution that is not having impact in the communities for which they serve and which they surround. And those aren't the stories that are always told, right? And so from a government standpoint, it's a balance sheet. It costs this much. You want how much more of our budgets? You're doing what? People can pay for it. Why should we do this? And that story isn't translating. And then when you go from public to private, it gets into a whole nother ballgame. The reality is that some of the work that I tried to do in those spaces, and my seat wasn't necessarily directly in education, but I worked across many different fields, is actually about bringing people to the table and showing the actual impacts and commonalities. Because time and time again, when we really started, and this happened, I will say we probably had the greatest success during COVID, because there were so many needs that we had as a society. I'll take us as a state. In our higher institutions, many were positioned in certain ways, particularly if they had a medical center, some of the research that was going on, the facilities that they had that had space that we could hold different things in, or we could stage different things in. They became immediate partners. And in a state like Kansas, our higher ed institutions, community colleges, and the 4 years are all over the states and can hit almost all of my counties by a certain number of miles. They became tremendous partners in creating support services that might have been education adjacent, but not always. And so it allowed different conversations to happen, to look at them through a different lens as a partner in a community. We have to now work to sustain that now that we've kind of reverted back to old times and basic budget conversations. But I will say that's one of the things that I hope that is a lesson that we don't lose from the things that we learned through COVID. There was a lot, right? And there was a lot of damage and harm and hurt and loss. But there were also things that we figured out how to do through the red tape, through the complexity, through it takes time. And some of that we have to continue to capture in the biggest part, whether it's higher ed and state government, whether it's healthcare systems and higher ed and state governments. We figured out how to deliver, and we figured out how to deliver services well and fast and effectively, and we cannot lose that.
I love it. I just want to have you talk for hours. Very inspiring. So I want to shift to you. And before we dive into the real, the questions that people always love, I do want to ask the obvious one for me, which is, you have done these really important things. I'm just curious what the through line is for you. What's the North Star in your career? Because I'm sure it was very weird to get that. I don't know if it was a phone call from the governor who said, hey, we need your help. But I bet you weren't looking for a job in government at the time. So I'm just curious, what's the through line? State Department, higher ed, these significant roles, Board of Stanford, like these, what is that for you?
Impact, right? My entire career has been in public policy because I know the power of resources leveraged into communities. Policy and the resources that policy govern change lives. And so I have always looked for opportunities where I know that I would have impact, where the work that we're doing, that you could see the lives that were changed through and through. The call from the state was not one that I was expecting. We were doing some great work, Bridget, at KU, closing those gaps and, increasing, retention, persistence, graduation, and impacting lives. But when that call came and the offer was there, it was an opportunity that I knew from my federal work and the work I had done across higher ed and across communities that we could have an impact. And we did across those 4 years. We didn't know what was coming, but that impact, being in spaces where you can leverage a diverse perspective and experiences into how resources are marshaled and are allocated is tremendous. And that's the role that has really driven whatever seat I've been in.
That's great. Doug, if you have one, I can let you, but okay, you're on mute. So DeAngela, I want to ask you this question because I think I have an idea of where you're going to go. Have you learned more from good examples of leadership or bad? And specifically of the good leadership example you've learned, who's like the leader that taught you about leadership?
So I've learned a lot from bad examples, don't get me wrong, but I will say that I think I have truly learned the most from good examples. And the leader that, and there's been many, but I will tell you the one that really stood out, it was Secretary Colin Powell. And I was at the State Department and was a special assistant at the time that Colin Powell was in office. Was in various roles, but my last role before I left state was as a secretary and a special assistant to in legislative affairs. So we did all the legislative work for the secretary. Would go to the Hill with him. All of those types of things. The thing about him, and if anyone's ever read his book, of course, he talks about leadership and how he leads. But for me, it was both the humility and the kindness and grace, right? Like, not a lot of leaders know how to give grace. And part of that is because of the pressure that sits with us, right? But the way he led, the way he stopped to get to know people, to spend time with people, to understand who they were and how they impacted the work that he was doing, was something that it was something to behold, like to see him, right? And you knew it was genuine, right? Like naturally genuine because of then conversations he'd have about people later, or how he would connect or bring up things about people at a later date. That for me stuck with me because that grace, humility, and kindness, those are things when you lead in that way, you can truly impact not only the work that you're doing, but the people for which you lead.
So, Bridget, I don't know if you're ready to move to the to your final few, but we usually close with it sounds like you learned a lot from more watching Colin Powell than anything he particularly said. But I guess Bridget likes to ask what advice you find what advice has been most useful to you as a leader that was sort of given to you.
Yep. So I would say that, and this was from actually one of my early mentors. It was with the State Department, Ambassador Ruth Davis. She was actually the most senior ranking African-American person at the State Department when I entered. She was over our Foreign Service Institute, where we got trained. You trained all of the Foreign Service people there. And she instilled in me this idea around preparedness, right? And this idea that you must always be ready when the opportunity presents itself. And so for my very first tour, I was supposed to go to Beijing, China for 2 years. I was all excited. And 2 days before I started training, I got a call and she said, "You're going to get a call and they're going to ask you to do something different. 1, you're going to say yes." And she said, 2, you need to be ready to tell them what you want in return. And it was mind blowing. I was like 23, going in the State Department. I was like, if they called me and told me something, I was like, okay, what am I supposed to do? But this idea of being ready, that you've prepared yourself, that you've done the work, that you have the experience, that you're ready, but being ready for that opportunity, right? That you're prepared, the opportunity comes. That preparedness carries you so far, you and your organization. So she always taught me, she said, you must be ready. But being ready is you being prepared and have done the work so that when the opportunity avails itself, they know you are that fit to lead, to serve, or whatever that looks like.
Okay, you have to tell us what they asked and what you asked for.
So they asked me to take a stretch job. So I ended up going to Guangzhou, China, and being the management officer there, which was actually 2 steps or 2 grades above my original job. And they were going to send me there instead of Beijing. And in Beijing, I was doing a general service officer, and then I was going to do visas, which all foreign service officers have to do, junior officers. But I still wanted Beijing. It was just Beijing. So they only needed a gap for about 9 months. So I said, can I go and be the management officer? And then can I still have my 2nd year rotation in Beijing during my visa work? And they agreed. So I served a year and some change in Guangzhou, and then about a year and a half in Beijing, and got to see both northern and southern China, a consulate, an embassy, just 2 different parts of that world. And they said yes, like that.
I love it. All right. So the advice that you've gotten, and then is there a book that you most frequently recommend for people around leadership that's helped you?
Oh, there's lots. I will say that I do because I think strategically, and then also creatively. So I always tell people, particularly when they're starting or when they get into the slump, to go back to like the 90-day plan. I know it's like cliche-ish, but I'm like, there's some good stuff there where you just need to stop, think, plan, and go. And we think of that as something you use right at the beginning of planning, but you'd be surprised. Sometimes you can stop, right? Pause and use it at a pivotal point when you're trying to make some decisions and look at that same tool set in that way. And then the other one is a Stanford professor who wrote a book on creativity, Tina Selleck. And so her book is one of those that I love just because it talks about the power of creativity and what that means and innovation and all of that work. So those are probably two of my go-tos when I'm thinking or when I need to like get myself refreshed. And then other than that, I just love reading like fun novels, like stories, and I love reading like people's journeys, right? And stories, their memoirs, right? Of anyone and in any places, because I think those journeys inspire us, they push us, they challenge us. And then sometimes particularly when you can see yourself in that story, it reminds you that some of this journey that you're not alone. And that's the piece that sometimes is the hardest when you're leading for anyone. But particularly as a woman and a woman of color, when you're leading, sometimes you just need to remember, like, I'm not the only one out here, and hearing someone else's journey like inspires you to keep going or to go differently.
Perfect. I know we should wrap. I do feel like people are going to want us to ask you, what is the advice you find yourself giving other people that you think about our audience who are administrators, faculty, they're all over. Is there advice about leadership that you would give to them that you most frequently give to other people?
So my golden rule is it's nothing new or groundbreaking, but it is that you have to leave it better than you found it. The work that we do and how we do our work has to be in such a way that it can't be dependent on you being a dynamic leader only. It can't be dependent on you moving the things and making progress. You must do it in an intentional and a way that it is sustainable, that it can't be easily undone or eroded. At the end of the day, when you leave, you must leave it better than you found it.
Perfect. I feel like we couldn't have scripted it better. Everyone's going to be super inspired, and they're going to totally now they're going to all know. Dr. DeAngela Burns-Wallace, thank you so much for sharing your insight, perspective, and wisdom with us. I think we're all richer for it. And Doug, thanks for being an excellent co-host. And for those of you at home, we will see you next week. Thanks to our sponsor of Mainstay, and otherwise we'll see you soon. Thanks.